The water was warm against Bathsheba's skin as she slowly poured it over her arms, watching the droplets shimmer in the moonlight before rolling down into the stone basin below. The night air carried the faint scent of jasmine, mingling with the steam rising from the water. It was a rare moment of quiet, one she had learned to cherish. The streets of Jerusalem were always alive with voices, merchants haggling in the markets, women drawing water from the wells, children laughing as they ran barefoot through the alleys. But up here, in the stillness of her courtyard, she felt as though the world had momentarily stopped, holding its breath in anticipation of something unknown. She dipped the cloth into the basin, wringing it out before running it over her shoulders, savoring the feeling of the cool night air against her damp skin. The weight of the day slowly lifted from her body, the endless preparations, the tending of the household, the waiting. She had spent so many nights waiting for news, waiting for letters, waiting for him. Her husband Uriah was away once again, fighting for King David, as he always was. She had married a warrior, and with that came a life of solitude, a life where she was little more than a name he carried in his heart but rarely had time to hold in his hands. It had been months since she had last seen him. She had stood at the city gates the day he left, watching as the soldiers disappeared over the horizon, knowing that it could be weeks, months, perhaps even years before she saw him again. And she had accepted that, because it was expected, because it was her duty. But duty did not erase loneliness. She had not chosen Uriah. Her father Eliam had made that choice for her, as fathers did for their daughters, and it had been a good match. Uriah was not only a soldier, but one of David's elite warriors, a man of honor, trusted and respected among the king's mightiest men. He was strong and disciplined, a man who never bent, never wavered, never faltered in his devotion to his king. Yet, for all his loyalty, he had never truly belonged to her. She thought back to the night of their wedding, the soft glow of the lamps flickering around them, the scent of fresh bread and spiced wine filling the air. She had been young, uncertain, her heart beating with the kind of naive hope that new brides often carried. She had watched Uriah from across the room as he laughed with his fellow warriors, his presence commanding even in moments of celebration. When he finally sat beside her, he had spoken gently, yet there was a distance between them that she could not place. "You are my wife now, Bathsheba," he had told her, his voice steady. "I will protect you always." He had meant those words. She had no doubt of that. But protection was not love. He had been kind, respectful, dutiful, but distant. When he was home, his mind was elsewhere, speaking of battle formations, of strategy, of his brothers in arms, and when he left, she was expected to wait, to keep the home in order, to be there when he returned. And so, she had waited, and waited, and waited. The sound of trickling water filled the courtyard as she tilted her head back, allowing the last of the warmth to roll over her skin. A part of her told her not to think about these things, to push them away like she always had. She had a husband, a home, a place of honor among the wives of Jerusalem. She had everything she was supposed to want. But then why did it feel like something was missing? A cool breeze drifted through the courtyard, making her shiver as she reached for a linen cloth to dry herself. It was then that she felt it. A presence. A gaze. Her eyes flickered upward toward the palace that loomed above the city, its windows glowing like golden embers in the dark. The palace stood high above the rooftops of Jerusalem, its grandeur undeniable, a symbol of power, authority, and the man who ruled over them all. She had lived in this city long enough to know that, from the king's vantage point, he could see nearly everything that happened below. Had she been seen? The thought sent a strange shiver down her spine, not fear, not shame, but something deeper, something unspoken, something that she did not dare name. Surely she was imagining it. Surely it was nothing. And yet, somewhere, beyond the torches of the palace, King David was watching, and fate had already begun to turn. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the marketplace, mingling with the distant sounds of merchants setting up their stalls, the braying of donkeys, and the chatter of women gathering at the well. Jerusalem was waking, but Bathsheba had been awake for hours. Sleep had not come easily the night before. Something had shifted in the air, something unseen but felt, a weight pressing against her chest, whispering of change. She moved through the courtyard, her hands busy kneading dough as she listened to the voices of the servants nearby. They spoke of the usual things: supplies running low, the neighbor's child learning to walk, a festival approaching in the coming weeks. But her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes flickered toward the palace. Had she truly imagined it? The feeling of being watched, the presence lingering in the darkness? It was foolish to think of it now. The king had far more important matters than the idle routines of a soldier's wife. She sighed, brushing flour from her hands. She needed to stop thinking about it. She needed to... A sharp knock at the gate froze her in place. The servants turned toward the entrance, their murmuring quieting to a hush. The knock came again, firm, commanding. Not the knock of a neighbor, not the knock of a friend. Bathsheba wiped her hands quickly and moved toward the gate, her heartbeat quickening. One of the servants opened it cautiously, and the moment the doors parted, a messenger in the king's colors stepped forward. Her breath caught in her throat. "Bathsheba, wife of Uriah," the man said, his voice steady, practiced. "The king has summoned you." The world around her stilled. She could feel the eyes of her household on her, waiting, wondering. The king, summoning her. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind at once, but she quickly silenced them. This was not the moment for questions. A summons from King David was not a request. It was an expectation. She glanced down at her flour-covered hands, suddenly feeling exposed, unprepared. "Give me a moment to make myself presentable," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The messenger gave a small nod. "Be quick." Bathsheba turned and walked inside, her hands trembling as she reached for a fresh robe. A servant rushed forward to help her, adjusting the folds of fabric, smoothing out her hair. "What does the king want with you?" the woman whispered, concern lacing her voice. Bathsheba shook her head. "I don't know." And that was the truth. But deep inside, she already felt the answer. The journey to the palace felt both endless and far too brief. The streets were alive with people, but Bathsheba barely noticed them. The palace gates loomed ahead, the guards stepping aside as the messenger led her through. She had been inside these walls before, on festival days, when the people gathered to celebrate, when King David stood before them and spoke of victories, of the favor of the Lord upon Israel. But this was different. This was not a public summons. This was private. The moment the heavy doors closed behind her, she felt the shift in the air. The silence of the palace halls wrapped around her like a cloak. She was led through corridors, past rooms filled with rich tapestries, past courtyards where fountains trickled softly in the afternoon light. And then the messenger stopped. "The king awaits you inside." Bathsheba swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the folds of her robe. This was not a dream, this was real. She took a steadying breath, then stepped forward. The doors opened, and she entered. And there, Standing in the golden light of the high windows was David, King of Israel, the man who had changed the course of her life before she had even spoken a word. The doors closed behind her, and she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Bathsheba stood just inside the door, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her robe. The room was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that came with power, with expectation, with something unspoken yet undeniable filling the air. King David stood across the chamber, his posture relaxed, but his gaze unwavering. His presence was commanding even without words. He had always been larger than life, a warrior, a leader, a man after God's own heart. The people of Israel spoke of him with reverence, admiration, even love. And now, his eyes were on her. "Come closer." His voice was steady, smooth, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. Bathsheba hesitated, her feet frozen in place. She had imagined many things in her life, but standing here alone with the king in his private chamber was never one of them. "Do not be afraid," David said, his expression unreadable. She forced herself to move forward, stopping at a respectful distance. He studied her, his eyes lingering just a moment too long before he spoke again. "Do you know why I summoned you?" Bathsheba wet her lips, searching for an answer. "No, my lord." David exhaled softly, stepping toward her. "You were bathing last night." Her stomach clenched. So he had seen. Her mind raced. Had she been careless? Had she lingered too long in the courtyard, unaware of the eyes watching from above? Had she unknowingly invited his attention? Numbers, she had done nothing wrong. And yet, here she was. "You are a beautiful woman, Bathsheba." His voice was low, measured. There was something in it, not just admiration, but possession. Her pulse quickened. What was she supposed to say? That she had not meant to be seen, that she was the wife of Uriah, a man who had pledged his life to David's service? That whatever had brought her here, it was not her doing? But none of that mattered now, because David was a king, and she was a woman alone in his chamber. The silence stretched between them, heavy and inescapable. Bathsheba lowered her gaze, her heart pounding. She had always known her place, a wife, a daughter, a woman of Jerusalem. But now she was something else, something caught in a moment she could not escape. "You are the wife of Uriah," David said at last, though there was no hesitation in his voice, no acknowledgement of what that meant. "Yes, my lord," she whispered. "He is away at war." A statement, not a question. He already knew, of course he knew. Uriah had left months ago, fighting for the very kingdom whose ruler now stood before her, watching her, waiting for something unspoken to be acknowledged. She should have refused him. She should have stepped back, should have pleaded to leave, should have reminded him of his honor, of his position, of the commandments he had been anointed to uphold, but she didn't. Because how does one refuse a king? Because what choice did she truly have? And so, as David stepped forward, as his fingers brushed against her cheek, as the weight of inevitability settled over her, Bathsheba realized. This was not a choice. This was a moment from which there was no turning back. And before the night was over, she would no longer be just the wife of Uriah. She would belong to David, and the cost of that moment, it would change everything. Bathsheba sat at the edge of her bed, her hands resting against her lap, her fingers trembling in the quiet. The dawn had barely begun to break, the faintest light creeping in through the narrow window of her chamber, casting long shadows against the walls. She had not slept. She could still feel the weight of last night, the heaviness of what had happened, of what could never be undone. David had not forced her, but she had not been free to refuse him. What choice did she have? To deny a king was to deny power itself, and to refuse him, she did not dare to imagine what might have followed. But the choice had been made, and now she was no longer the woman she had been yesterday. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to push the thought away. But the memory of his touch was still there. The way he had looked at her, the way he had called her beautiful, the way he had spoken her name like it was something he had always known. And for one fleeting moment, she had allowed herself to feel special, to feel chosen. But in the gray light of morning, it did not feel like being chosen. It felt like being claimed. Days passed. She returned to her home, to the familiar routine of her life, but nothing felt the same. She was still Bathsheba, still the wife of Uriah, still the woman the city had always known, but inside, she was someone else now, and no one, not the servants, not the neighbors, not even the walls of her home, knew the truth of what she had done. She was living in a silence so thick, so suffocating, that she thought it might consume her. She prayed. She knelt before God, whispering words she was too ashamed to speak aloud. She asked for forgiveness, for understanding, for peace. But her stomach twisted every time she thought of David, every time she imagined Uriah coming home, touching her, loving her, not knowing what had happened in his absence. How could she live with this? How could she go on carrying this weight alone? And then the first sign came. She woke one morning feeling ill, her body betraying her with the unmistakable signs of what she already knew in her heart. She was with child, David's child. And now the secret she had buried could no longer be hidden. She sat in the courtyard, her hands pressed to her stomach, her breath coming short and shallow. She knew what this meant. She knew what was coming. The laws were clear. A woman caught in adultery could be stoned. The whispers would spread. The shame would follow her like a shadow. And Uriah, he would know. Her husband, the man who had fought so many battles, would finally face the greatest betrayal of his life. The thought made her feel sick. She closed her eyes, steadying herself, willing the world to stop spinning. But there was only one answer, only one man who could fix this. David. She had been called to him once. Now she would call upon him. She reached for a servant, her voice barely above a whisper. "Send word to the king. Tell him, I am with child." The servant's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded, moving swiftly out of the courtyard. Bathsheba gripped the edge of the bench beneath her, pressing her fingers into the stone. She had no idea what David would do, but whatever happened next, this could not stay a secret any longer. And somewhere deep inside she knew the cost of this mistake was only beginning to unfold. The letter was sent. Bathsheba sat in silence, staring at the walls of her chamber, waiting for a response. Her hands trembled against her lap, her breath unsteady. She had done the one thing she swore she would never do. She had betrayed her husband, and now she had sealed it in words. "I am with child." She imagined David's face when he read those words. Would he be angry? Would he send her away? Or worse, would he do nothing at all, leaving her to face the consequences alone? The weight of that possibility pressed against her chest like a stone. If David refused to act, she was lost. She could not hide this forever. And if the truth was revealed, she would be branded as an adulteress. David was a king. She was merely a soldier's wife. Men like David did not fall, but women like her were crushed beneath the weight of their shame. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the doorway. The waiting was unbearable. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She simply waited, and then the messenger came. Bathsheba stood in the courtyard as the servant approached, his face tight, unreadable. "What did the king say?" The man hesitated. "He has sent for Uriah." Bathsheba's breath caught. "Uriah?" she whispered. "Yes, the king has summoned him back from battle." She gripped the edge of the stone bench beneath her, her mind reeling. David was bringing Uriah back to cover the truth, to make it seem as if her child belonged to her husband. She had not expected this, had not even allowed herself to imagine what the king might do, but now this plan, this lie, it terrified her. Because she knew Uriah, and he would never be so easily deceived. Uriah returned within days, dust clinging to his cloak, the scent of battle still on his skin. Bathsheba saw him from the shadows of their home, watching as he walked through the streets, his face unreadable, his body stiff with exhaustion. He had no idea that his wife carried another man's child, no idea that his king, the man he had sworn his loyalty to, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. She should have run to him, should have embraced him, kissed him, spoken to him as she always had, but she couldn't, because she knew the truth, and the truth was a wall between them, a wall that would never be torn down. That night she listened as David spoke to Uriah. "Go home," the king said. "Rest. Be with your wife. You have earned it." Bathsheba's hands clenched. She knew what David was doing. If Uriah lay with her, he would believe the child was his. He would never question it, never suspect, never know the truth. She held her breath, waiting. But Uriah did not leave the palace. Instead, he slept among the servants, refusing to return home. David called him back the next day. "Why did you not go to your wife?" Uriah lifted his head, his jaw set. "The ark of the Lord is in a tent. My fellow soldiers are in the fields. How can I go to my home, eat, drink, and lie with my wife while my brothers fight for Israel?" Bathsheba closed her eyes. Of course. This was the man she had married. Loyal, righteous, honorable, even when the world was not. She felt sick. Because no matter what David tried, Uriah would not be fooled. She did not see her husband after that. She did not know what David planned next. All she knew was that one day Uriah had been here, alive, strong, determined, and the next he was gone. A letter had been sent to the commander of the army, and Uriah had been placed in the front lines where the battle was fiercest, where he would not survive. Bathsheba heard the news like a dagger slicing through her chest. Uriah the Hittite has fallen. She staggered back, her breath leaving her body. She had known, deep down, she had known, that David would find a way to rid himself of this problem. But she had not let herself believe that Uriah would die for it, that her husband's loyalty would cost him his life. She fell to her knees. Grief clawed at her chest, suffocating her, drowning her. Uriah was dead, and it was because of her, because of David, because of a night that should have never happened. The weight of it was too much to bear. She wept bitterly, not just for Uriah, but for the woman she used to be, because that woman was gone, and whatever came next, it would not bring her back. The days following Uriah's death were a blur of grief and silence. Bathsheba sat in the dim light of her chamber, her hands pressed to her stomach, where the weight of her secret still grew inside her. Uriah was dead. David had made sure of that. And now she was a widow. Her home, once filled with quiet expectation, was now empty, cold, suffocating. The neighbors whispered as they passed by. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment thick in the air. Had they suspected something before? Did they know now? The mourning period began, and Bathsheba did as was expected. She wore the sackcloth. She wept in the streets. She sat in silence as mourners passed by, offering empty words of comfort. But what did they know? They did not know the truth. They did not know that her tears were not just for Uriah, but for herself, for the woman she had been before, for the life she had destroyed. She had not killed him, but she had not stopped it. And the blood on David's hands stained hers as well. Then the summons came again. Another message, another set of words that would change her fate. The king has requested you. Her breath caught in her throat. David. Again. What else was there to say? What more could he take from her? She was no longer a married woman. She was no longer Bathsheba, wife of Uriah. She was a widow, carrying the child of another man, and David had made certain there was only one path left for her to take. The wedding was quiet. No grand celebration, and no feasting, no dancing, no joyful songs filling the palace halls. This was not a love story. This was a repair of a broken thing, a covering of a scandal, a rewriting of a mistake. Bathsheba became David's wife. She stood before him, adorned in fine linens, wearing the crown of a queen, but she did not feel like a queen. She felt like a woman trapped in a story she never meant to write. David held her hand. His touch was warm, firm, commanding. But there was no tenderness, no love, only ownership. She looked into his eyes, trying to understand the man who had taken so much from her. He had stolen her body. He had stolen her husband, and now he had stolen her life. But she said nothing, because what choice did she have? What could she do now except play the role he had written for her? She smiled where she was expected to smile. She accepted the whispers of the court, the knowing glances from the servants, the weight of the crown placed upon her head. And when the doors of her new chamber closed behind her, she wept. She was a queen now, but she had never felt so powerless. Months passed. Her child grew within her, a reminder of everything she had lost, of the life she had lived before. And then the pain came, the deep, unbearable agony that left her breathless, trembling. She knew something was wrong. The midwives whispered urgently. The palace was tense with quiet dread, and then, just as quickly as he had come into the world, her son was gone. David's child. The child conceived in sin. The child born from their greatest mistake. The grief that had settled in her chest from the moment Uriah died now consumed her completely. She had lost everything, everything. She lay in bed for days, the world moving on around her, but she could not move with it. David fasted, he wept, he pleaded with God to spare the child, but God had spoken, and his judgment was final. Bathsheba knew why. This was punishment for David, for her, for all of it. And there was no undoing what had been done. She thought, in those dark days, that she would never recover, that she would fade into the shadows of the palace, nothing more than a woman who had once been chosen and discarded by a king. But then in the depths of her despair, David came to her. For the first time since it had all begun, he truly saw her. He took her hands, not as a ruler claiming what was his, but as a man who had lost just as much as she had. He did not speak of their sins. He did not try to justify what had happened. He simply held her. And for the first time, she let him, because she had nothing left to fight against, nothing left but the man who had taken everything from her, and yet was all she had left. And in that broken moment, Bathsheba realized this was her life now. And somehow, she would have to live it. The palace was quieter than it had been in weeks. The hushed voices of the servants, the heavy stillness that filled every corridor. It was the kind of silence that followed grief, judgment, and the weight of God's hand. Bathsheba sat by the window of her chamber, staring out at the city below, watching the people go about their lives as if nothing had changed, as if her world had not crumbled around her. Her son was gone. Her firstborn, the child who had been both a secret and a scandal, both a blessing and a curse, was no more. She had cried until there were no more tears left, until her voice had grown hoarse, until her body ached from the weight of sorrow. She had pleaded with God, had begged for his mercy, but his answer had been silence. And now, all that remained was emptiness. She had thought that when she lost Uriah, she had felt the greatest pain a woman could endure. She had been wrong. This pain, the pain of a mother losing her child, was deeper than any wound, and she did not know if she would ever heal from it. She had expected David to keep his distance, had expected him to continue on as a king does, leading battles, giving commands, making decisions for a nation while she was left in the shadows, forgotten. But for the first time since it had all begun, David did not leave her alone. One evening he entered her chambers without a word, his expression unreadable, his step slow and careful. She did not turn to look at him. She had no words left to give. But then he knelt beside her, reaching for her hand, and she felt the warmth of his fingers wrap around hers. Not as a king, not as a ruler, but as a man who had lost, just as she had. "Bathsheba," he said softly, her name a whisper in the quiet. For the first time in a long time, she did not pull away. She had fought him. She had resented him. She had blamed him for all that had happened, but in that moment there was nothing left to fight. They had both lost. They had both paid the price, and somehow they were still here. She turned to him, tears burning in her eyes, and in his face she saw something she had not noticed before: sorrow, regret, pain. For everything, for Uriah, for their son, for what they had done. She did not know if she could ever love him, but in that moment, she understood him. And for the first time, she let him in. Time passed. The seasons changed, and slowly the pain lessened, never gone, never forgotten, but bearable. And then, life returned. One day, Bathsheba felt the first flutter of movement inside her womb, another child, a second chance. The whispers of the palace grew once again, but this time they did not feel like knives against her skin. This child was different, not born in scandal, not conceived in betrayal, but in redemption. And when the day came, When she held the tiny, squirming body against her chest, she felt something she had thought she had lost forever: hope. David stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. He too knew what this child meant. "His name will be Solomon," David said, his voice steady. "A future king, a child of promise, a child not born from sin, but from a God who restores what is broken." Bathsheba pressed her lips to her son's forehead, closing her eyes. She would never forget what had been lost. She would never erase the past. But this was a new beginning. And for the first time since it all began, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had been chosen for more than tragedy. She had been chosen to be a mother to a king, and that was a story worth living.